Welcome to the Politics News Wolf US channel. From defending Kiev to liberating Kherson, Ukraine's victories that stunned the world. The enemy planned to capture Kiev in 3 days. Now that 300 days have passed, instead of a blitz victory, the aggressors lost what they captured in the first days of the full-scale war. In shame, the Russians fled from Kiev region, Kharkiv region, and Kherson, the only regional center that was captured in Ukraine. Summarizing the year, let's recall the most successful operations run by the armed forces of Ukraine, their peculiarity and significance, and how they affected the further course of hostilities. Battles for Kiev. The invaders entered Kiev region from the territory of Belarus and tried to advance toward the capital. The settlements to the west of Kiev were the most affected ones: Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Vorzel, Moskun. There, the occupiers showed their true face. They tortured and killed civilians, raped children, and abused animals. Horrifying footage of Russian atrocities has traveled the world. But apart from terror, the occupiers ultimately failed to achieve any gains. At that time, the Russian Federation had the ability to strike using virtually all types of air, land, and sea-based missiles. The fire pressure was simply insane. The Russians significantly outmanned the Ukrainians in the area. Nevertheless, the armed forces forced the Russians to flee from the northern bridgehead. And this is the key feature of this episode of the war. Ukraine command chose the right tactics. 80 to 90% is defense and only 10 to 20% is counter-offensive action. That is, Ukraine chose the tactic of bleeding the enemy. We exhausted the potential of the enemy, gave them no opportunity to supply to their advanced units. Our subversive groups constantly operated in the enemy rear. Of course, there were many other tactical maneuvers due to which the enemy was forced to flee this territory. The Russian army did not hold out for a month, and at the end of March, they withdrew from Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions. That's even in spite of the fact that they received plenty of material and technical support from Belarus. But this did not help them. With their logistics routes cut off, being subjected to constant fire pressure with the impossibility of advancing closer to the capital and feeling the looming threat of an operational encirclement, the enemy was forced to flee, unable to deliver solid defense, recalls Kovalenko. Pavlo Lakichuk, head of military programs at the Center for Global Studies Strategy XXI, says, "It's no secret that our partners and the whole world were convinced that the Moscow mob would crush Ukraine, if not in 3 days, then in 3 weeks. But they never did. With some superpowers, at the cost of incredible sacrifices, we stood. We endured the most difficult 3 days. We withstood the most difficult week. We endured the worst month. And the invulnerable enemy rolled back." A new concept was born in military art: gesture of goodwill, that is, escape, which is passed off as something else. And Ukraine witnessed such gestures on the part of the Russians repeatedly over the following months. Liberation of Snake Island. At the beginning of the invasion, the Moskva cruiser, the Russian Black Sea flagship, took part in the capture of Snake Island. Then the Russians offered the defenders of the island to surrender, and they responded with a legendary phrase: "Russian ship, F***ck off, ed." This phrase has actually predicted the vessel's fate. On April 13, the cruiser was hit by 2 missiles launched by the Neptune coastal missile complex. And already on June 30, Ukraine liberated Snake Island, a strategically important point that provides an opportunity to observe the entire northwestern part of the Black Sea, coastal settlements, and trade sea routes. These events are really important. Because the Moskva missile cruiser was a truly unique ship that the Russian Federation will not be able to restore soon. And I'm not even talking about building a new one, says Oleksandr Kovalenko. The Russian fleet had 3 such cruisers. Now there's 2 left. The Moskva became the first destroyed flagship in the last 40 years of wars and conflicts. So much for a record. As for Snake Island, this operation demonstrated how the armed forces can force the occupiers to flee without even deploying its units to combat. Without landings or assaults, only with constant firepower, methodically and daily, we forced the Russian invaders to flee, thus completely destroying their plans, emphasized the military expert. The expulsion of the enemy from the northwestern part of the Black Sea, which was accompanied by the sinking of the Russian fleet's flagship carrying a symbolic name Moskva, Moscow, ed., became Ukraine's first symbolic victory. Although the strategic importance of depriving the enemy of dominance at sea is small, it is extremely important for intercepting the strategic initiative in the war. But still, the most important thing in the sinking of the Moskva and the liberation of Snake Island was the mental victory for the Ukrainians, Pavlo Lekichuk notes. Lekichuk also mentioned an old sailor saying, which says that ships should not be named after capitals. It will lead to nothing good. Oh, it won't. However, of course, this is only a superstition. We believed in our own strength, we believed in the power of Ukrainian weapons, Lekichuk is convinced. Counteroffensive in Kharkiv region and liberation of Kherson. In September, the armed forces launched an impressive counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. Back in the summer, Ukraine led an offensive in the Kherson direction and sent certain signals. Then residents of Kherson region were called to evacuate, and the president publicly gave an order to the army to liberate Kherson region. So the Russians expected an escalation on this part of the front. In the end, the successful information campaign yielded results. The Russians found themselves under threat of encirclement and began to flee from Kharkiv region en masse. The armed forces of Ukraine quickly liberated Balaklia, Kupiansk, Izium, and Vovkansk, almost the entire Kharkiv region. Also, they captured a record amount of enemy equipment. Russia has ironically almost become the largest supplier of heavy weapons to the armed forces of Ukraine. And after Kharkiv region, a counteroffensive took place toward Kherson. On November 11, the armed forces entered the city and pushed Russian troops back to the left bank of the Dnipro. The counteroffensive in Kharkiv region is a separate story in general, which will certainly be included in military textbooks. The pace of the liberation of such a large swath, more than 8,500 square km, perhaps can't be compared with anything else, says Oleksandr Kovalenko. In addition, it was in the Kharkiv region, or rather in the Izium district, where the largest armored group of the Russian occupation troops was amassed. We saw how the successful use of mobile assault groups, as well as the cutting of the main logistical arteries and the daring actions of the armed forces of Ukraine forced the enemy to flee and abandon their fully operable and armed tanks. This is a record-breaking operation that deserves the attention of military experts at the world level, emphasizes Kovalenko. But the right bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson region was liberated due to a long-term operation. It consisted of several stages, which were implemented gradually, starting as early as May. We exhausted the enemy's units so much that they had no opportunity to continue holding the right bank. We made them run. This is somewhat reminiscent of the situation on Snake Island: constant fire influence, pressure on positions, destruction of control and support systems, destruction of logistics. Another brilliant operation by the armed forces. Meanwhile, Pavlo Lekichuk puts the operational and strategic operations of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kharkiv direction and on the right bank of the Dnipro in the same line. Just as the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of the Kursk Arc in World War II, despite their different nature and geography, became links of a strategic operation whose purpose was to deprive the enemy of a strategic initiative, so did the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive operations, despite the fact that they were completely different in terms of planning and the nature of their implementation, the composition of the forces involved, and the time frame, ultimately, had the goal of seizing the strategic initiative from the enemy, imposing their own agenda on them. And it succeeded, emphasizes the head of military programs at the Center for Global Studies Strategy XXI. Strikes on enemy strategic airfields. Early December, Russian military airfields in Ryazan, Vyugulov, and Saratovo, Engels, were hit. They are one of the elements of the Russian nuclear deterrent forces, the nuclear triad that was supposed to demonstrate to the whole world the Russian nuclear might and of which Putin was incredibly proud. Ukraine has not officially taken responsibility for those explosion incidents. At the same time, there were no refutations either. But the main thing here is different. It turns out that Russian strategic aviation is extremely vulnerable to external attacks, although it was supposed to be protected better than the Kremlin. Strategic bombers can be disabled by cheap drone strikes, the cover of important air defense air bases is set up very poorly. And the most important thing is that the whole world saw this, including the United States and Europe, which have been repeatedly intimidated by the Russian nuclear stick. The mentioned incident can be compared with something like the explosions in Sevastopol Bay or on the Kerch Strait Bridge. All this is a demonstration that there is some force, let's call it an UAV, that can exert influence on the objects of the Russian occupiers in their deep rear. Isn't that a shame? Asks Oleksandr Kovalenko. The answer here is absolutely obvious. When starting the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the Russians did not even fathom it turning into hostilities on their own territory. Pavlo Lekichuk says that this SMO was supposed to become for ordinary Russians just an exciting action movie on TV, where good little green men erase imaginary Ukrainian Nazis from the face of the earth. Let's go, that's what we have to do with them, the deep people in Russia was supposed to exclaim from their armchairs. But the explosions in the occupied Crimea, on the Kerch Strait Bridge, at airfields and ammunition depots far in the rear of the Russian Federation became a shocker, a cold shower on a red-hot head, emphasizes Mr. Lekichuk. Strikes on deep enemy rears made the aggressor think about the prospect of retaliation. The predictions of Generals Zaluzny and Zabrodsky came true, the main advantage, the center of gravity of the aggressor, which must be deprived of it, is impunity. It is impunity that is the center of gravity of the Russian occupiers from a military point of view. Yes, we cannot yet adequately respond to the enemy effort due to limited resources. But it is quite possible to oppose the enemy's ability to act in a similar way and at a similar range. An example of such an approach is the physical transfer of hostilities to the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea, to military facilities in the depths of Russian territory, the military expert convinces. It is clear that the above is far from a complete list of successful operations completed by the defense forces of Ukraine over these 10 months of full-scale war. Obviously, the most important and brightest victories are still ahead. They will be preceded by more difficult days and weeks. However, in order to defeat the enemy today, it is extremely necessary to obtain the weapons of victory from Ukraine's partners. I know how to defeat this enemy. But I need resources. I need 300 tanks, 600 to 700 BMPs, 500 howitzers, says the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, General Zaluzny. And Ukraine also needs modern air defense equipment, planes, artillery, and ammunition for it. I am sure that we will have it. The international terrorist and aggressor must be punished. Victory will be ours. Added the Commander-in-Chief Pavlo Lekichuk. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel to update you with daily information.